Hey everybody, welcome to the Foul Play YouTube channel.
Well, thank you there, Mr. Kratz. How come you're so cheerful this morning?
Oh, sugar, I'm always cheerful. I'm just such a wonderful man.
Well, of course you are. Well, look, everyone, thank you so much, guys. It's really great to be here. Thank you for joining us in chat. And who've we got so far? We've got Jaznaz Gaming. We've got Checking Convictions. We've got Crockett. We've got Andy B. We've got Kelly. Dark Side of the Moon. Love and Malta. Angie Dickinson, Anthony Hills, Colette M. Who else we got? Okay, we've got Alex. Of course, she's on the panel. Look, guys, welcome so much. It's great to be here. Thank you for joining us. And before we commence, all of us from Foul Play want to wish all of you mothers out there a happy Mother's Day. I hope that your family is pampering you and that you've got your feet up and you're relaxing. Probably you're the one that's doing all the running around and cooking and looking after your family. But look, guys, happy Mother's Day, guys. You know, what else can I say? It's a beautiful day. I hope it's a beautiful day for you guys as well. Look, thank you so much for joining us. This is our regular podcast entitled Reading with Uncle Ken, and we're on part 56 at the moment. And for those of you who are unfortunate enough to have a copy of the book, we're on chapter 15, entitled The Day the Circus Came to Town. What we're going to be doing, of course, is we're going to be continuing reading our passages from the book, and we're going to get responses from our panel and also from you guys that are in chat. So look, guys, yes, Anthony Hills mentioned Dolores, and we mustn't forget Stephen's mum. She passed away, and never got to see the chance of seeing her son come home, and also her grandson as well. And we think of all the mothers, of course, that have passed away. They're in our thoughts as well. Well, look, guys, thank you so much for joining us. If you like what we do, please subscribe to our channel. And look, a big special thank you for the members who have taken out a subscription, a YouTube subscription, and who are supporting us. Look, guys, it really, really helps. As you know, through a lot of hard work by Jack61, Sunshine Christina, and many other people on Foul Play, we've been able to obtain a lot of documents through FOIA, and they certainly have been eye-opening. And I believe that Jack61 has been successful in obtaining a lot of other documents on CDs. Is that correct, Jack61?
Well, it's supposed to be on the way. I haven't heard back. They said it would take a little time to, I guess some of the stuff had to be sent to a third party to be copied. I'm guessing that maybe there's the micro cassettes and some other stuff that they approved my request. So I haven't heard back. I was actually just telling Susan before we started, I hope to hear from them this week. So hopefully we'll have 50 plus CDs coming here soon.
Wow.
Yep.
Wow. And again, guys, we want to thank you guys who are in chat, who've taken out subscription, who've also purchased merchandise. And I know that Susan and Zoe have done a huge amount of work putting all that together. Thank you so much for your support. As you know, what we like to do is the money that we obtain from your support, we like to use for the purchases of documents through FOIA, and we place those documents in our extensive library. Jack61.
Not only the FOIA documents, I mean, depending on what we get, depends on cost, but court documents, everybody needs to remember those are $1.25 per page. That's non-negotiable, and we're forced to pay it. if we want it. I mean, if you remember back several months ago, we got those 10 or 11 hearings that we didn't have of Brendan's hearings, and it was $833 or some nonsense. It was insane how much that cost. Fortunately, for court documents, or I mean for like a regular, police reports and that kind of thing, 15 cents a copy per page from, I think, Calumet. I think Manitowoc charges 25 cents per page. It just varies, but it all adds up. And it's not only that. One more thing, the website, getting that has to be paid for every year. Any subscription stuff that we use for research, that has to be paid for too. So every little bit helps.
Yeah, and also like getting, I think we also have a subscription to the newspapers as well.
That's right.
Document. Well, yeah, and that all costs. But again, guys, thank you so much for your generosity and for your support. We use that money wisely. So, we invest it back into foul play to get documents so we can place them up on our extensive library, or for you guys as well. Again, guys, if you like what we do, please give us a thumbs up. We appreciate your support, and we're really, really happy. Our number of supporters have increased over time, and that's been great. Jack 61.
I'm sorry, Doc. One last thing I want to add, and this is a big thank you to, I don't recall, Cherie. She has been so fantastic on things that are federal that she can get because she has a PACER account. She gets those for us. Just bam. I mean, if I ask, bam, I've got it. And, that takes up. Yeah, I mean, I can't thank her enough because I never have to ask her twice. She just does it. And, she works full time, and there are other people too. They're very generous in donating documents or audio, whatever. Big thanks to them too.
Correct. And again, guys, look, I mean, we all know, right? The Stephen Avery, Brendan Dassey cases are extensive, right? They're very complex. They're very large. Not one person can fully comprehend the cases. That they're very, very involved, large. And it really involves and it takes a huge team effort to really understand and also unpack to what has occurred back in 2005. So, I'm very thankful to be part of this team. I believe that we are doing great work, and we have an extensive body of work as well to back everything up that we've done over a period of several years. And speaking of foul play, I'd like to welcome our new staff member to foul play, Yuriz. And, a round of applause for Yuriz. He's done an incredible amount of work over a long period of time. And if you come to our website, you'll see that Yuriz has constructed a clickable map, basically putting together a lot of the forensic evidence and a lot of the events that took place. And you can see by clicking on the map, you can get photographs, you can get documents, you can get videos. And that represents a huge amount of work. Plus, he's also done a lot of stuff involving spreadsheets. So he's made a lot of hard work. He's done a lot of hard work to make it easier for you and I. And Yuriz is he's an incredible guy, very humble guy. And we're so pleased to announce that Yuriz is now a new staff member of Foul Play, and we welcome him to the family. Such a hardworking guy. All right, and I believe he likes pineapple as well, which is even better. Well, look, guys, so that we don't waste any time, because I know that Susan has to leave very soon because she has another commitment, I'd like to welcome the panel. Just say hi and how you're coming along. First, we have Alice. Alice, how are you coming along?
Hi, Doc. Doing great, thank you. Hi, everyone in chat. Hi, everyone in panel. Thanks for coming.
Awesome. Thank you, Alice. Secondly, we have I Don't Recall.
Hi, everybody. Doing well.
Awesome. Thank you. I don't recall. Next, we have Susan. How are you coming along?
I'm doing great, Doc. Thank you. Welcome, everybody. Glad you're here.
Awesome. Thank you, Susan. Next, we have Jack61.
Doing fine, doing good. Thanks for coming, everyone. Hope you enjoy the presentation today.
Thank you very much, Jack61. And finally, we have Neverly. Neverly, how are you?
Hello, Dr. Silkman. Hello, panel, and hello, everybody in the chat. Doing great over here. It's a beautiful day, and I'm ready for this podcast. Can't wait to start.
Thank you very much, Neverly. And hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Silkman from the Foul Play team. Welcome to, it's a bit of a cold day here in Adelaide, South Australia, but yeah, you're right, guys. Can't wait for this podcast to start. All right, guys. Well, look, first of all, before we start the podcast proper, I'd like to also welcome Pete Moss. We have Cherie as well. Welcome, guys. Kelly Coles, and my apologies if I've missed anybody out. I'm sure we'll call your name out during the podcast. Thank you so much. Before we start the podcast proper, I'd like to give a big shout out also to Jeff Jones. Jeff Jones is doing a really great job spreading the word, so to speak. He's assembled together a panel, a group of members. I'm a panel member as well, where Jeff has been going through Making a Murderer 1. And as a panel, we have been discussing elements of Making a Murderer 1 at the moment. I tell you what, guys, even though most of us here have seen Making a Murderer probably 10 or 20 times, it's truly remarkable how many things that you've missed or how many things that you have now picked up as a result of increasing your knowledge. It's truly remarkable. And also, if you haven't caught Paul Capaldi, big shout out to him as well. He's done a series of interviews with various panel members here, and he also did an interview with Big Jeff. Check it out if you can. All right, guys. Well, look, thank you so much. We're going to start the podcast proper. Susan will be leaving us soon, so we'll make a start. Now, as you know, guys, Ken Kratz wrote this particular chapter as a result of Making a Murderer 2. And in essence, what Kathleen Zellner has done, she's hired a group of experts from most places around the world to essentially debunk the forensic findings by the state and their investigators. So Mr. Kratz felt compelled to write several chapters trying to debunk Kathleen Zellner's experts. And as you know, so far in this chapter, we've discussed the blood that was found in the RAV4. We've talked about the key that was found in Stephen Avery's bedroom. We've talked about the hood latch swab as well, that was taken many months after the fact. And last week, we talked about the cremains that were found in the burn pit, Yunda Burn Barrel number 2, and also in the Manitowoc County gravel pit, and the shenanigans that surround the cremains. We know that there was no forensic anthropologist on site, and we know that the coroner herself was threatened with arrest. And so there was plenty of shenanigans. But however, this particular element of the chapter that we're just about to go into, I believe, is probably one of the most important pieces of forensic evidence that was used against Stephen Avery very, very cleverly in order to sink him during the trial. And this is point number 4 in his chapter entitled The Day the Circus Came to Town. This particular subsection is called the bullet. Now, there's no doubt that most people around the world, and certainly in the panel and in chat, know about the bullet. And the bullet, of course, that we'll be talking about today is item FL. Now, this is very important because I believe This is the number one item, forensic piece of evidence, I believe, that was very, very cleverly used by the state against Stephen Avery. And I'll tell you, and we'll break that down. So in essence, what we know so far, now we know that allegedly cremains were found in Stephen Avery's burn pit. Those bones, those cremains, were sifted by Erdl and his team, and the cremains were given to Dr. Bennett. After Dr. Bennett had confirmed that the cremains had come from an adult human female, the box of cremains were eventually given to Dr. Leslie Eisenberg. Now, Eisenberg had examined the cremains, and it took quite a long time to go through the cremains. Now, at the same time, she was also examining cremains from Yunda Burn Barrel number 2 and also from the Manitowoc County gravel pit. Now, when she had a look at the cremains in the box from the sifted bones from the burn pit, she found several cranial bone fragments, right? Now, remember, all the bone fragments that were found were all relatively small. They were burnt, they were fragmented, and they were in tiny pieces. But she was able to find some cranial bone fragments. Now, there's a few interesting things about those cranial bone fragments. When she tried to reassemble them together, what she noted were, I quote, unusual openings. So basically what she had discovered was the presence of beveling. So what happens is when a high velocity projectile, like a bullet, goes into your skull, it leaves a bevel. So in other words, the bullet enters into your brain. Now, depending on how high powered the bullet is, the bullet can either remain lodged in your skull or transit your skull, go right through your skull. What Dr. Eisenberg discovered were cranial bone fragments that had beveling. So beveling means that a bullet has entered into the skull. Now, the thing about the skull is that the skull is extremely hard. The skull has got two layers, an outer layer and an inner layer. So when a bullet transits a skull bone, it leaves a hole, a cavity, right? It's called a bevel. So she found two such bevels. She was able to reconstitute part of the skull. Now remember, only 35% of the skull was recovered, and the skull fragments were all heavily fragmented and burnt. However, she was able to determine that the victim, and in this case Teresa Halbach, was shot at least twice in the skull. Alice, do you have a comment?
Colette in chat is asking, are there any pictures of the beveling?
Yes, there are. So that's a very good question. So what Dr. Eisenberg did after she documented the beveling, the cranial bone fragments were photographed, and we've done foul play, myself, we've done plenty of presentations on the Dr. Eisenberg's report and her findings. And yeah, there are photographs of the beveling caused by bullet strikes. Now, when she was able to reconstitute part of the skull, she had determined that Teresa Halbach was shot at least twice in the skull, once at the back of the head and once to the left-hand side near the temple. So this is very reminiscent of an execution-style shooting scenario. But it was rather bizarre that she had, Teresa Halbach had been shot at least twice in the skull, once at the back and once near the left temple. So what Dr. Eisenberg did she got the cranial bone fragments and got them x-rayed. Now, when the cranial bone fragments were x-rayed, what was discovered on the x-rays were tiny white flecks very close to where the beveling was. Now, what happens is this. A bullet is normally coated with lead, and it can be surrounded by copper. Some bullets are copper jacketed. So when a bullet enters into a skull or strikes bone, it actually leaves part of itself embedded in bone, right? So that's your classic standard diagnostic piece of evidence of a transiting bullet. It actually leaves part of itself embedded in bone. So when the cranial bone fragments were x-rayed, there were white flecks. That's all indicative of a bullet strike. So the investigators, Fassbender and Uyghur, knew that Teresa Halbach had been shot at least twice in the skull. Now, people in the audience, whoever's in the audience, you guys are absolutely correct. No bones have actually been tested, right? So no genomic DNA have been extracted from bones to definitively prove that the bones do in actual fact belong to Teresa Halbach, right? But all that controversy aside, muscle tissue, which was connected to bone, was genomically tested, and there was a 7 out of 15 allele match. So my assumption at this stage is that those cremains belong to Teresa Halbach. Now, guys, anybody in the panel, is that a reasonable assumption? Do you think that's a reasonable assumption that those cremains are indeed of Teresa Halbach? Guys, what do you think? Who would like to answer that one? Neverly.
Well, I have my theory, or actually what I think is probably not popular or approved by you, but it's hard for me to believe that it's hers because it's so convenient what they found. How convenient. You know what I mean?
Yes, it is. It is. And
It's very hard. I mean, we're missing 60% of the body, yet they know that she was shot at least twice in the head, and they actually have that to prove. I don't know.
Correct. And yeah, correct. And I understand everyone's concern. But the thing is that the item BZ was burnt basically to the same level as the other bone fragments, including the cranial bone fragments. Allegedly, all those bone fragments were found in the one location. When Dr. Eisenberg looked at all the human cremains, and I'm talking about the burn pit, the burn barrel, and the Manitowoc County gravel pit, she had surmised that all the bone fragments had come from one victim. Neverly.
Okay. Could you just repeat about the 7 out of 15 alleles, what that proved, and where did they get it from?
Okay. So essentially, now remember, we don't have in situ photographs, okay? We don't have in situ photographs of the cremains. That's a real worry for me. So the only thing that we've got to rely upon are reports. So we know that item BZ allegedly was found in the burn pit. Now, for some strange, unknown reason, item BZ happened to have some charred muscle tissue still attached to the bone. And so what had happened was Dr. Eisenberg described several pieces of charred muscle tissue, not just one, but several. Item BZ went to Cherie Cohen, and muscle tissue went to the FBI. So from item BZ, Cherie Cohen was able to extract human genomic DNA from the charred muscle tissue. She was able to determine that the genomic DNA extracted from item BZ gave a 7 out of 15 loci match to the pap smear belonging to Teresa Hallbach. The reason why it was 7 out of 15 was because the DNA was badly burnt. So the DNA got damaged, right? So therefore, normally you would expect a full genomic DNA profile, but because the DNA itself was damaged due to heat, which is perfectly legitimate and understandable, it meant that the starting material that Culhane had was not very good. So there was a 7. Yeah, sorry, Neverly, continue.
So my question is, if this was way back when, in 15 years ago, right?
2005.
Yeah. So going by today's standards, and science has improved, medicine has improved, technology has improved, what is the today's standard for DNA matching? Isn't it like 20?
Yes, it is. I think it may have even increased as well. So essentially, before you can call an individual unique and identified, I believe that the FBI demands a 20 out of 20 match. It may be even higher. A 7 out of 15 match meant statistically that the cremains, there was a 1 in a billion chance that it didn't belong to Teresa Hallbach. Right? So you can't just, it's a 1 in a billion.
But my point is, if today we examine the same item BZ and it says, it comes back with 7 out of 20, would that be considered a match, or would they just say cannot be excluded, which leaves it up in the air because it could be somebody who's related to her, I guess.
Yeah, well, potentially yes. And I know that Mrs. Hallbach was asked whether she had any other siblings that were missing or dead. So, yeah, I mean, look, guys, at the end of the day, it's statistics, right? But even though it was a 7 out of 15 loci match, it was a 4. Remember, there were 14 alleles that actually matched. But you can't just take item BZ in isolation. You've got to take into account many other factors as well, including the fact that the skeletal remains were from an adult human female. Teresa Hallbach is missing. No one has ever seen her after October 31st. So once you start looking at not only the genomic DNA evidence, but the mitochondrial DNA evidence, because remember, the FBI did mitochondrial DNA analysis, and the mitochondria had matched to Karen Hallbach, which is the mother of Teresa. Mitochondria are inherited directly from your mother, which meant that Teresa Hallbach could not be excluded. Now, I understand your concerns, but when you have a look at all the evidence in total, I am convinced that the cremains are indeed from Teresa Hallbach. Alice, do you have a question or a comment?
It's actually an agreement. I agree with Anthony Hills, because you've also got to take into account, Doc, that we're only taking Culhane's word for it and Eisenberg's word for it, So can we actually believe, with the stuff that we know now, can we actually believe that these tests are accurate? I mean, Eisenberg got a thing wrong in a case, you know what I mean?
I do.
So, I mean, if she can get something as a fetus wrong in a predominant case, what's to say that the results that she's come up with for this case aren't wrong as well? You know what I mean? And then you've got Culhane, who, in my opinion, owed the state a favour because she was the one that got Stephen out in 2003. And that gave him the go-ahead, I suppose, or the thought process of suing the state. So the state had a bone to pick with her, because if it hadn't have been for her getting him out, then he wouldn't have been suing the state for $36 million. You know what I mean? So I think that they've went to her, well, you owe us, lady, because you're the one that got him out here, and he's the one that's now suing us for this money, so you owe us. And then you've also got to remember the message for Aspender as well, saying, put her in the garage or trailer. So, can we actually believe any of the results that these women have came forward with, you know?
Correct. Now, thank you very much, Alice. Now, you've got to remember, I'm probably one of the harshest critics of both Culhane and Eisenberg, right? There's no doubt. I've criticized them for years now. What I'm doing is I'm presenting what was presented during the trial and what the forensic evidence is to suggest that those cremains do indeed belong to Teresa Hallbark. You can't just take the DNA evidence by itself. You've got to take all the evidence. Now, remember, it was Dr. Bennett who had identified those cremains belonging from an adult human female. It wasn't Dr. Eisenberg. So Dr. Bennett independently had determined that those cremains were from an adult human female. Eisenberg also did, but she had used other diagnostic bones to determine the same thing as Dr. Bennett did. Neverly, do you have a comment?
Are you saying that you're saying all of this about that is Teresa because of the mitochondrial DNA and profile and 7 out of 15 and 14 alleles and whatnot, based on, you're just going based on the documents that we found, read and researched, or is that your opinion as well? Let's say you get that in your lab and you're trying to conclude, is this 7 out of 15 or modern days 20 or 22? Would you say this is Teresa or not? Sorry for putting you on the spot.
No, not at all. Not at all. From the evidence that we had that was obtained at that time, we're talking about 2005, right? And the mere fact that Teresa Hallbark, or the victim, if you want to call it the victim, had been cremated, right? Essentially burnt down to bone fragments. The mere fact that anything had survived the cremation process is indeed a miracle, right? Because if you put a human being in a professional crematorium, nothing's going to be left except bone fragments. The mere fact that there was some muscle tissue remaining, that's a miracle in itself. You cannot draw any definitive conclusions from the material available. You can only quote statistics, right? And Culhane, based on a 7 out of 15 loci match, it's a 1 in a billion chance that it wasn't Teresa Hallbark, So if you look at statistics alone, it means that approximately 7 people in the world, right? If you're looking at population statistics in 2005, it meant that maybe there were 7 people around the world that had the same profile as what Cherie Culhane was able to obtain. 7. Okay. When you factor in the mitochondrial DNA, it now makes the case even stronger that those cremains are indeed Teresa Hallbark, because the FBI could not exclude the cremains, the burnt muscle tissue, as not belonging to Teresa Hallbark. So in other words, everything was consistent of the cremains actually belonging to Teresa Halbach. So that's genomic DNA analysis, mitochondrial DNA analysis, using forensic analysis of the bones, and having a look at the blood, saliva, and touch DNA in the RAV4. All of them were a 100% match to the Pap smear, right? So we know that Teresa Halbach, her blood, her saliva, and touch DNA were in that RAV4. So when you take everything in total, I am convinced that those cremains are indeed of Teresa Halbach. Jack 61. No worries, Neverly. Jack 61.
Yeah, given all the issues that and problems we have with Culhane and what she did, and the cremains itself, and the lack of proper photography and anthropology at this alleged burn area. One of the bigger problems I have is what we're talking about is Adam FL,
Yes.
and how this was all. It was all a big lie, and it was all an implied thing that Kratz and basically all of them did. But touting these two skull fragments that you mentioned earlier, and then they present Adam FL. Of course, we know about Adam FK too. But without him actually coming out, and he didn't do it, Jensen really kind of did. He didn't say that bullet specifically went through Teresa, but it was still heavily implied that it went through her brain, right?
Correct. And that's exactly what we're going to go through. But I understand. Thank you, Jack 61. I understand people's concerns, right? You absolutely have to identify the victim, right? You want to make sure that whoever you're claiming Stephen and Brendan had murdered was indeed in that burn pit and elsewhere, as it turned out. What is very frustrating, of course, and I agree with Neverly, I agree with people in chat, there was really no second chance for Kathleen Zorner's experts to re-examine the cremains. Now, as you know, today, especially now in 2022, there are new modern DNA methods which can extract DNA from burnt cremains, and successfully. There are new, more sensitive PCR techniques that can be used in order to basically obtain a DNA profile from those cremains. In order to get a 15 out of 15 or a 20 out of 20 loci match. Whenever you have an element of doubt, this is exactly what you get. You get controversy. People don't understand what's going on. So, the question is, well, really, is that Teresa Halbach? Yes or no? Anecdotally, if you look at all the evidence together and not just in isolation, it's a very strong case that Teresa Halbach was at least shot twice in the skull, definitely dismembered and cremated. There's no question in my mind. Neverly, do you have a comment?
Yeah. Okay, even though I don't understand the science behind and all of that, thank you very much, Dr. Silkman, and no offense, I really don't, so I can't pretend to know what I'm talking about. That's why I'm asking all these questions. I think that for a lot of people, the frustration is because we don't trust Culhane, we don't trust the lab, we don't trust LE because they did what they did. And that's why we're all questioning if that's really Teresa, because I, and I'm sure a couple other people, if I may have the liberty to say that, feel like, like she breached the protocol. That was enough for me not to trust her no matter what she says. And I think that they were invested to, make this case fit their purposes. So I think that's the frustration. It's not even, if that's Teresa or not, is the fact that you cannot trust the source. Do you see what I'm saying?
I do.
Yeah.
But there is no dispute. If you don't believe that's Teresa Halbach, it meant that there is a victim that was shot twice in the head, at least twice in the head, that has been dismembered and has been cremated, and that victim's cremains are in Stephen Avery's burn pit, Yonder burn barrel number 2, and in the Manitowoc County gravel pit, right? That, you have to admit, is the truth. And Neverly, do you have another comment?
I'm talking against Cohane and her protocols and, ethics and whatnot. So, because remember the
Correct.
1985 case, so I'm not going to go into it. But also, this whole probability and statistics reminds me of Hillary, what's his name? Hillary Jones? Is that his name? The guy, no, that's Garrett Jones. Oh my gosh.
That's Nick Hillary.
Nick Hillary, there you go. Nick Hillary.
Correct.
Remember how the prosecution hired this lab
Correct.
who did the statistics? It had nothing to do actually with DNA, remember?
Correct.
So
But
just, I don't know, it just sits wrong with me. But I'm not an expert, so there you go.
correct. But in that particular case, the DNA evidence was extremely weak, right? There wasn't even an association between Nick Hillary and Garrett Phillips, right? The DNA in that particular case was extremely weak. The DNA in this particular case is much more stronger, right? Because remember, think about it, guys. If there was just one allele that was different to Teresa Halbach's pap smear, then you can eliminate the victim as being Teresa Halbach. The fact that you've got a 14 out of 14 allele match to the pap smear is pretty strong evidence that those cremains are indeed from Teresa Halbach, right? So when you're doing DNA typing, if you don't have a 100% match, it means that you can exclude that person. The mere factor that the genomic DNA evidence and the mitochondrial DNA evidence could not exclude Teresa Halbach, I think, is pretty strong evidence that those cremains are indeed from Teresa Halbach, right? Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think anyone has got proof positive identification of Teresa Halbach anywhere else on the planet. I know that people have said, oh, look, it could be that person in Canada, etc., etc. But no one's had any definitive sightings, right? And think about it. Why would Teresa Halbach side with the MTSO in order to frame Stephen Avery, right? Why would a young woman of 25 years old essentially give up her life and go into witness protection, all for the sake of Stephen Avery? I find that hard to believe. Alice, do you have a comment?
No, it's actually quite a funny thing from BW Haggis in chat. Welcome, BW.
Welcome.
They said, I could do a better job than Culhane, and I got kicked out of biology class because the teacher asked, how do plants reproduce? And I said, probably missionary.
All right. We've got to get BW Haggis onto the panel. Look, trust me. My professional field is in molecular genetics. I did my whole PhD dissertation looking at molecular markers like Cherie Cohane has used. I know how they work. I know about statistics. I had done family analysis myself when I was doing my PhD studies. So I understand what it means by looking at statistics. Would have you wanted more than 7 alleles or 7 loci? No question. The more loci, the better. But from what we have at that stage, when you look at the genomic DNA analysis, when you look at the mitochondrial DNA analysis, when you look at the bones that were found, the analysis of the bones, and when you look at the presence of the blood, saliva, and touch DNA in the RAV4, all of those items having a 100% match to the pap smear, I think you can safely conclude that those cremains are extremely likely to belong to Teresa Halbach. Neverly, do you have a comment?
Nan Life 7 in chat, hello Nan, asks, was the DNA evidence in this case trustworthy? Could any of it been disguised, hidden, faked, since so much else was? Plus, I think that Nanzo and everybody else remembers what Jean Couchet said.
There's no question. Look, there are elements of this case, and that's why I want to talk about item FL, which are incredibly dodgy, right? Incredibly dodgy. But think about it. The state want to make sure that the victim is Teresa Halbach, right? They don't want to eliminate the victim as being somebody else. But frustratingly for Cherie Cohane, she was only able to get a 7 out of 15 match, right? It would have been very, very suspicious had she got a robust genomic DNA profile from the burnt cremains, because what happens is the DNA becomes damaged, right? So what will be very interesting would be to have a look at her laboratory book and have a look at the original results and have a look at the graphs of the alleles that didn't come up. Were they very, very low level? Were they indicative of being Teresa Halbach or what? So the only thing that we can comment on are the reports that have been released, right? So I'm only giving my opinion as to the results. Do I trust Cherie Cohane? Nope. Do I trust Dr. Eisenberg? Nope. But I'm not basing it, Neverly and panel, I'm not basing it on just the DNA results. I'm looking at everything in total, and that's the way you've got to do it, because you have to account, where is Teresa Halbach? We know that the victim that was found in the burn pit, the underburn barrel number 2, and also in the Manitowoc County gravel pit, all belong to one individual that was a female, right? An adult female, roughly about the age of Teresa Halbach. So when you take into account all the factors, now remember, it wasn't just Cohane, it wasn't just Eisenberg that did the analysis. It was the FBI that did independent analysis. It was also Dr. Bennett, who was the first person to look at those cremains. So we've got independent review and analysis of the cremains, right? And also the genomic DNA and mitochondrial DNA extracted from muscle tissue. When you take all together, I'm pretty well convinced. Neverly.
Thank you so much for explaining and going out of your way to explain all of this, because it's really hard for me, and I bet a couple other people, to comprehend. It's just I'm very, 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 I just don't trust Cohane, what she's doing, and her motivation and pressure. Maybe she's not rotten herself, but she was under super pressure. Who knows? That mistrust makes a lot of people, wonder,
Yeah,
that's all. But thank you so much, Dr. Silkman.
Yeah, no question. Thank you so much, guys. So we really need to get back to item FL, right? So when we had a look at when Dr. Eisenberg looked at the cranial bone fragments, right? There was evidence of beveling, and there was also evidence of flecks, and the flecks are caused by lead. So there was evidence that the victim was shot at least twice in the skull, once at the back and once near the left temple. So there were beveling. Now, the investigators knew about this, right? Dr. Eisenberg had written up a report and told Fassbender, I can't remember the exact date, but told Fassbender that the victim, Teresa Halbach in this case, had been shot at least twice. So we know that's quite likely how how Teresa Halbach had died. Now, we don't know whether Teresa Halbach was alive before being shot, or she died as a result of being shot. We don't know. But what Dr. Eisenberg said was that after Teresa Halbach was shot, she was dismembered and then cremated. And she could tell that by the way the bones were burnt. So we know, and I know this is a big call. We know that Teresa Halbach was shot at least twice in the skull, right? Now, Tom Fassbender knew this, and we know that Brendan Dassey was interrogated many, many times by Fassbender and Wiegert. Now, we know that fateful March 1st interrogation. Alice, do you have a comment?
It's Nan's Life in chat. Hi, Nan's Life, welcome. Would the beveling determine the distance the victim was shot from?
That's a very good question. What is extremely well, put it this way. Because we've only got bone fragments, right? And you can't reconstruct the entire skull. It's very difficult to determine the degree of fracturing. So normally what happens is when you're shot with a bullet to the skull, depending on the caliber of the bullet, the distance, well, think about it. It's a high velocity projectile for a start. The state did not determine, I don't think they even measured what caliber of bullet it was that struck Teresa Halbach in the skull. I don't believe that. And remember, they did not have a full bevel. They only had a partial bevel, which meant that they didn't have a complete cranial bone fragment that had one bevel intact. A Jack 61.
Okay, it seemed like I read that they tried to come up with some kind of caliber for the bullet, but they failed.
Correct. Because the reason why it'll be difficult is because they don't have this total circumference of the bevel. They've got part of the circumference, and they can make a sort of like a guesstimate, but we'll talk about it in a second, but they only got partial beveling. Now, what happens is when a bullet strikes skull, it explodes on the inside. So you get tiny bone fragments which are shattered and released into the brain. So you get like a cone effect. The hole on the outside is smaller than the hole on the inside because as the bullet transits, it explodes the bone plate. So you get what is known as a bevel, which tends to indicate very strongly that Teresa Halbach at these two particular sites was shot by a bullet, not by an arrow, not struck by a hammer at these particular locations, but actually shot by bullets, right? So the evidence is pretty strong to suggest that Teresa Halbach was shot at least twice in the skull. Now, Tom Fassbender knew that Teresa Halbach had been shot. And despite extensive questioning by Fassbender and Wiegert, Brendan Dassey never, ever mentions a shooting scenario, ever, right? And as we know, we've seen the very, very painful discussion, interrogation of Brendan Dassey on March the 1st, where they keep on asking Brendan, what did you do to the head? What did you do to the head? And Brendan Dassey kept on guessing, punching, strangling, cutting off hair. He never said, oh yeah, we had shot her, until Wiegert said to Brendan, who shot her in the head. And of course, well, Brendan never did. Brendan didn't know about any shooting scenario. And he unfortunately said Stephen did. And Fassbender asked him, well, why didn't you tell us that? And Brendan, does anyone remember what Brendan's response was? Jack 61.
Although I couldn't remember it.
Yeah. Now, I'm telling you right now, are you trying to tell me you're going to conveniently forget shooting someone at least twice in the head and about another 8 or 9 times in the body? That's something you're never, ever going to forget. But quite clearly, Brendan had no idea. So Brendan had admitted that Stephen had shot Teresa Hallbach at least around about 10 times. Now, in the head and in the body as well. So, you know that after March the 2nd, there was that press conference that Kratz did where he scared the nation and he gave the scenario about what had happened to Teresa Hallbach, right? Now, at the same time, they got a search warrant and they were able to go back into the garage and into the trailer and start looking for further forensic evidence. Now, does anyone want to summarize what the searchers and investigators found in Stephen Avery's garage? Who'd like to have a go? Jack 61.
After an extensive search, jackhammering, this is the garage, of course, they didn't find any DNA belonging to Teresa Hallbach. They did come up with a dust-free bullet laying under the compressor, which we all know now contains wood and paint, and sold it. Well, I think they also picked up item FK as well.
Correct. Thank you, Jack 61. So remember the investigators initially in November went into Stephen Avery's garage multiple times. Now, there's no doubt that Stephen Avery's garage was extremely messy. There was junk absolutely everywhere, which means one thing, that if you shoot somebody that many times, you're going to produce a lot of blood, right? Now, I know that Mr. Kratz said, oh, well, maybe they put Teresa Hallbach on a tarp. Well, think about it. I don't think there are many bulletproof tarps out there, right? And there would have been a lot of blood absolutely everywhere. And you've all seen films that show slow motion when bullets strike an object that contains blood. You get spatter and you get a fine mist of blood, right? Now, there is absolutely no way you can now try and clean every speck of blood that comes out of a human body when a person is shot up to 10 times, especially in the skull. And if you've seen any pictures, unfortunate pictures or images of when someone is shot in the head, you're going to expect a lot of blood. Now, Neville, you're a nurse, right? What would happen? What would happen if you get a massive head wound from a gunshot wound?
There is such thing that's called pink mist, basically. That's when the head explodes, and among the chunks and, particles and pieces of skull, you also get this fine mist. That would
Correct.
be, just like, we all know what mist is, and that gets in every single crevice that's possibly porous, that it's not like a glossy surface. So, and that's no matter what you do and what you clean, you just can't, because blood can survive a long period of time. But
Correct.
we all watched Dexter, and that's the only time that I've seen that it could be completely, that blood particles could be completely eliminated. But joking aside, I don't know what they were thinking when they said that, and I'm very, 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 very frustrated and skeptical.
Correct. And Crockett in chat talks about back spray, and that is indeed what happens. Yeah, you're going to get a fine mist of blood coming out, and also depending on the caliber of the bullet, if the bullet exits the skull, you're going to get a massive amount of blood being produced as well. If you don't believe me, just have a look at the Zapruder film when John F. Kennedy gets struck. Well, it's controversial where he actually got struck from the back or the front, but he definitely got struck by several bullets. His head, the top of his head, exploded, and there was absolutely blood everywhere. Now, we know that Teresa Halbach was shot at least twice in the skull, once at the back, once on the side, on the left, near the left temple. But remember, guys, these were entry wounds. Dr. Eisenberg found no evidence of any exit wounds. So there was no crater created. They never found any bone fragments that indicated an outshot. In other words, a bullet transiting the skull and exiting. They found no evidence of that. And you must remember that around about 35% of the skull was recovered as fragments, and no one knows where the rest of the skull is. No one knows where that is. Alice, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I was just going to say, Doc, it was from the front. He got shot from the front.
I agree. But all jokes aside, you can see that when the head is hit by a high velocity bullet, it exploded, right? His head literally exploded. There was blood everywhere. The blood covered the limousine. There was blood on the street. It was everywhere. Now, what the state are trying to say in this particular case is that Stephen Avery and Brendan Dassey were able to remove all traces of blood in the garage. All traces of blood in the garage. Now, correct me if I'm right or wrong, but they also tested the rifle that was eventually found in Stephen Avery's bedroom, hanging above his bed on a holder. Did they find any evidence of blood on that rifle? Yes
Nothing.
or no? Jackson?
Yeah, nothing. They didn't find no blood. No.
Yeah. So normally if you place a gun very, very close to somebody, especially the skull, and you pull the trigger, there's going to be splatter of blood that's eventually going to end up on the rifle, maybe even in the barrel, right? When the rifle was examined, they found no fingerprints, they found no blood, and they found no DNA at all. Now, you may argue that, maybe Stephen had cleaned it up, but the problem is, how are you going to clean up fine mists of blood? It's going to be really, really difficult to do it. So they found no blood and no DNA belonging to Teresa Halbach on the rifle, right? Now, Alice, do you have a comment?
Yeah, I mean, Jack's showing the photos, Doc, of the garage. And there is no way in hell, the way that garage is cluttered like that, no matter how much of an expert you think you were at cleaning up anything, even the biggest experts would not be able to clean up every single speck of blood that would have been in that garage if she was shot in that garage. Even if she was assaulted or stabbed or, or throat slit or whatever. There is no way in hell that you could have got every single spot of blood. I mean, you've just got to take like the true crime programs and things like that we watch. Some of them get caught because of just a wee speck of blood found somewhere under a table, on a bit of carpet, under a couch, or a bit of cushion, or something like that. And that garage is far too cluttered for them to have been able to clear up every spot of blood. So when they
Correct.
go on about that garage and everything like that, I just let it go over my head now. Because we
Correct.
all know it's a load of crap.
That's correct. And thank you, Alice. And I want to compliment what Nan's Live 7 said, you know, and I quote, if you were a juror and seen those photos, would you believe the story prosecution told? And Crocker Thompson said, no. And of course, that's 100% correct. And that's why it was important for the jury to actually take a visit and have a look at the way the trailer was constructed and the way the garage had so much stuff in it that it's impossible to hide micro droplets of blood. Now, Jack 61 put up some pictures showing that when the investigators went into the garage, they luminol treated it, right? They sprayed luminol everywhere. Then what they do is they turn off the light and they look for areas of fluorescence. Now, there's only one problem with luminol. Luminol is not 100% diagnostic for the presence of blood, right? You got to do a presumptive test. I believe it's using phenolphthalein to determine the presence of blood. But they got a lot of areas which they use chalk to mark off, where the luminol gave a positive reaction. But there's one problem with luminol, and that is it's non-specific for blood. There are many items, for example, bleach and other motor oils and other components that come out of cars that can also give you a positive test for luminol. So, yeah, it did look very impressive that all this luminol came up. But when they swabbed the garage, when they looked for the presence of Teresa Hallbach's blood, tell me, Jack 61, did they find any blood belonging to Teresa Hallbach in Stephen Avery's garage?
Not one molecule.
Right. Now, to make matters even worse, right, they jackhammered, I'm not sure whether you've got pictures of it, Jack 61, but they also jackhammered parts of the concrete, right? Because remember, Kayla had told her school counselor, can blood soak up from the ground? So their way of thinking was, so if Teresa Hallbach had been shot or stabbed, had her throat cut or whatever, in the garage, there'll be a huge volume of blood and it will soak into the concrete. Now, I'm telling you right now that you're not going to be able to clean up that blood that's soaked into the pores of the concrete. So what the investigators did, they brought in a jackhammer and they jackhammered a large section of the concrete, right? And so they tested the concrete. Now, Jack 61 or any panel member, were they able to find any DNA belonging to Teresa Hallbach in the concrete that they had jackhammered? Did they find it, Alice?
No, they did not.
All right. So, guys, we've got a huge problem, right? According to what Brendan Dassey said, right? First of all, he told the investigators we had shot Teresa Hallbach at the side of the garage, right? That's what he said. The investigators, Fassbender and Uyghur, said, no, you're wrong, Brendan. We don't think you shot her on the side of the garage. Then Brendan Dassey said, we put her in the RAV4 and we shot her in the RAV4. The investigators told Brendan, no, you couldn't have shot her inside the RAV4, right? So then Brendan finally said, oh, yeah, that's right, we shot her on the floor. So despite extensive spraying with the luminol, despite extensive swabbing, despite the use of presumptive tests for blood, despite jackhammering the concrete, they found no blood pertaining to Teresa Halbach absolutely anywhere. Now, I know that the guiltists sort of say, well, you know, maybe they used bleach or whatever, etc., etc. There's only one problem with that. They did find blood in the garage. Does anyone know whose blood that actually belonged to? Who would like to answer that one? They did find the presence of blood in the garage, but who did it belong to? Check 61.
It was Stephen's blood.
Correct. Near, I think, the back of the Suzuki, which then goes to show that Stephen and Brendan could not have extensively cleaned that garage to basically sterilize it of all the presence of blood belonging to Teresa Halbach. So, in other words, they debunked themselves. Now, let's get on to item FL. Alice, you have a comment?
Yeah, I was just going to say, Doc, the thing that bugs me as well is the fact that Aspender and Uyghur got Brendan on the bleached jeans, you know. That Wayne could have got that bleach on the jeans 6 months before, year before this whole incident, you know what I mean?
Correct.
But because they found bleach-stained jeans, then, that was it. He must have wore them to help clean up the garage, you know?
Correct.
And they coerced that Wayne into saying that along those lines, you know what I mean? And
Correct.
that really got up my goat, that they could get away because there was a bleach bottle in there and there was bleach stains on Brendan's jeans, that they
Correct.
put two and two together and came up with 6, you know?
Correct. And there's some really interesting comments in chat. That's correct, Crockett. The argument and what Brendan Dassey stated was that they actually put in the RAV4 in the garage, which meant there would have been precious little room to have placed Teresa Halbach on the ground and have shot her, right? And potentially there could have been blood spray on the RAV4 everywhere, right? And of course, the only blood of Teresa that they found was inside the RAV and not on the outside of the RAV. And then, of course, we've got that mysterious A23, which no one knows whose blood that actually belongs to. So a shooting scenario inside Stephen Avery's garage actually makes very little sense. And there was a comment, I think, by Anthony Hills, and I quote, "The jeans were stained, so there should still be hemoglobin on the jeans, but there was none." 100% correct. So they would have checked for the presence of blood. Now, believe it or not, DNA can actually survive several washings of clothing, right? So DNA, there's been studies done that if you get some DNA on your clothes, despite washing your clothes through several cycles, some DNA can actually survive. They clearly found no DNA belonging to Teresa Halbach on Brendan Dassey's jeans. So, from a purely forensic viewpoint, despite extensive luminol treatment, presumptive tests using phenolphthalein, jackhammering of the garage, they found no DNA belonging to Teresa Halbach at all. And there was a very interesting comment made by Chuck Avery. And this was a very early statement he said. He stated that if someone had discharged a weapon, I would have heard it. Because remember, you had Chuck, Earl, Mama Avery, some of the boys that were next door. None of them, not one person ever recall the shooting of a gun. Now, according to the state is saying that Stephen Avery had shot Teresa Halbach 10 or 11 times. Now, guys in the panel and also chat, has anyone ever fired a .22 rifle? Yes or no? Check 61.
Many, many times.
Tell us, is it silent or does it make a loud?
It's It's not. I mean, I fired a 22, a 25 handgun, a 32 handgun, 38, 357, a 44, multiple different gauge of shotguns, and a 22 is not as loud as some, but it's still loud. You would definitely hear it.
If you fire a .22 inside a garage, would it be louder or quieter?
It would be louder because it's going to trap that sound. It's going to echo loudly. You'd definitely hear it for a good distance away.
Right. Do you recall whether anyone at any time on the salvage yard ever recall firing of a gun on October the 31st?
Not a single person. No one. No.
No one. Not at all. And Brendan Dassey never mentions a firing scenario until it was mentioned by Wiegert. And Neverly, have you ever fired a rifle?
Yes, I have. But my comment was that Anthony Hills actually has a question. He goes, at what time of the day did they fire the gun? And was that during the business hours, right? So it's not like they were by themselves in some secluded area, clandestine area.
Correct.
But they were right there. Broad
That's
daylight.
correct. We don't know the time of death, okay? And you can't work out the time of death either, because all we have are cremains. So you can't establish a time of death. There was no coroner or forensic anthropologist on site. Neverly, do you have another comment?
But I think we could surmise that it was relatively early in the evening, if not, like later in the afternoon, because they needed so many hours to burn poor girl to the smithereens, right? To 2-inch cremains.
Correct.
So they couldn't have shot her at 10 o'clock at night.
Plus the dismembering. You got to add that time in too.
Exactly. And phone calls. He was away, for 30 minutes on those 2 phone calls at least, and talking to his mom.
Correct. So you've got to understand that you need time. You need time and space if you're going to murder somebody. And when you factor in what Brendan Dassey said, that he saw Teresa Hallbach bound to a bed, shackled to a bed, and then when you listen to Brendan Dassey's interrogation, the way he described what happened to Teresa Hallbach, it seems to me that all of these events were occurring in the afternoon, right? Because according to the phone records, there was no more cellular activity on that phone after 2:41 p.m., right? And what the state is saying to you, is that the electronics were burnt in a burnt barrel by Stephen, right? So there was no more cellular activity after 2:41. So now what we're trying to conclude is this, and what Neverly was alluding to, if Stephen and Brendan had done this, they were doing the raping, chopping, burning during business hours, where anybody could have walked up to the trailer or the garage during business hours and either talk to Stephen or whatever. And so Stephen we now to believe that Stephen and Brendan took the risk of doing all of this literally in daylight hours. Alice, do you have a comment?
Yeah, just a couple. No, I've never shot a gun. I've never handled a gun. Couldn't tell you how loud they are, apart from what I see on TV when they have to wear the earmuffs. Because that's not a thing here in Scotland, The only ones that have got guns here are police officers and and farmers who go and shoot deer and, keep rodents off their land and things like that. So I couldn't tell you what a 45 sounds like compared to a 22. You know what I mean? I couldn't even tell you what they look like, never mind anything else. But
Correct.
for something in daylight like that, as we were talking about, somebody would have heard gunshots. With being as open and that where they were, it would have echoed as well, you know. And JD in chat, hi JD, thanks for coming. He says, so they originally said that Teresa was stabbed in the stomach, so why shoot a corpse, you know? But that's just it. There's that many
Correct.
shenanigans going on. We don't know whether she was stabbed or shot or whatever. It's only their word for it.
That's correct. And don't forget, the state actually came up with 2 different murder scenarios for the same victim, right? In Stephen's trial and in Brendan's trial. 2 different murder scenarios and 1 victim, and Kratz was able to get away with it. Okay? How in the hell can you kill someone in 2 different ways and it's the same victim when allegedly Brendan and Stephen were together? Oh, I still can't work that one out. Alice, do you have another comment?
BW Haggis says in chat, in Scotland, we don't have guns. We are a very stabby nation. Well, there's really anything else that we can get our hands on, you know what I mean? Apart from a gun, I mean, we'll try and use anything to hit somebody, you know, but we don't have guns, you know. So.
Correct. But guys, what I'm trying to, and I'll get to everyone on the panel in a second, what I'm trying to establish here is the logic behind this murder scenario. How could this horrendous murder have taken place? Could it have taken place in the time frame when one considers that Jody Stokowski had phoned Stephen Avery twice, especially at 2 critical times where Stephen was meant to be raping, mutilating, and cremating Teresa Halbach, and he sounded completely natural, and Jody Stokowski detected nothing of malice or change in Stephen Avery. Jack61, do you have a comment?
Got 2 comments. And first for Alice, I know you haven't been really around guns. I can only if you've been around like fireworks, I can give you kind of a comparison. It's not quite the same, so just take this with a little bit of a grain of salt. A 22, maybe even a 25 caliber pistol, they sound more like a kind of a loud firecracker. Then you move on up into like a 38 or a 357. That moves on up into a bigger firecracker like an M80, or we call them M80s, and there's also a cherry bomb. Those are pretty loud. And then when you move into like a 44 or 45 or even a shotgun, that gets into like a half stick of dynamite or whatever. They get really loud. I mean, you really need, anything really above about a 25, you really need ear protection if you're going to be firing a lot, because it will ring your damn ears. So, my second comment is there's this whole scenario that the Stowe painted. Like I said, I don't know how Kratz got away with what he did between Brendan and Stephen's trials, or how he painted 2 different pictures of the same murder. I still don't understand that from a state law kind of thing, right?
Correct.
It just blows my mind. I really thought that there was something on the books themselves that would not allow prosecutors to do that, because now that opens the door up. Seriously, it opens the door up to against other potential co-conspirators in a single crime.
100% correct. 100% correct. Because the bizarre thing here is that we have 1 victim, right? And we've got 2 different murder scenarios. And what's even more bizarre, in the Stephen Avery trial, they never called up Brendan Dassey, right? So hence they had to try Stephen on circumstantial evidence. But the bizarre thing about Brendan Dassey's trial is that none of the forensic evidence pointed to Brendan Dassey. The only thing that they could use against Brendan was just his words, right? So Brendan's Dassey trial was a rerun of Stephen Avery's trial.
That's exactly right.
Yet the same people saying the same things but not one of them could say Brendan Dassey did this, right? So they presented the same material twice, and in the end, Fallon had said, innocent people don't confess, right? So the jury found him guilty based on a confession. No one can say this piece of forensic evidence led to an association between Brendan Dassey and Teresa Halbach. There was no forensic evidence that tied Brendan Dassey to Teresa Halbach. Check 61.
Even convicted him of sexual assault, even though they had not one molecule of proof of that. Nothing.
Correct. 100% correct. Now, Neverly, correct me if I'm wrong, but you saw a documentary with Durst where he dismembered his next door neighbor, right?
Oh God, yes.
Yeah. Now,
With
what
the bosa.
with the correct? What was obvious at the crime scene? Do you remember?
There was, yes, people, we're composed of 75% of fluid, and we have like, I don't know how many liters of blood in us. There's going to be just pools of blood, just like Krat said, pools of blood everywhere.
Correct.
Everywhere. And
Correct.
it's not a clean cut. It's going to be sprayed all around you. And it's not
correct.
an easy deal to cut up anything, let alone a human body. Where is the emotional factor in all of this? We don't ever talk about it, the mental factor. It's one thing to dismember a deer and one thing to dismember a human body.
100% correct.
100%
correct. So if you ever see the documentary with Durst, he actually shot his next door neighbor in the head, dismembered his body, right? Dismembered his body, put his body parts in rubbish bags, went to a river and threw them away. He then went back at some stage to the crime scene and he got the head, because he knew that if they found the head, they would have determined that it wasn't a self-inflicted gunshot wound. It was from Durst himself who had shot his next door neighbor. So the point of going through all this is, who do we know faints at the sight of blood?
Pick me.
Never.
Brendan. Poor Brendan.
Brendan Dassey faints at the sight of blood. If you remove someone's arms, legs, and head with a hacksaw blade or a blade, are you going to be oozing blood?
No, you're not going to be oozing. You're going to be spraying blood.
You're going to be spraying blood.
Showered in blood.
Correct. So, how would Brendan Dassey be able to watch another human being being cut to pieces with a saw?
Poor guy. I have something else to say about Brendan.
Never.
At the time when he was at a trial and being interrogated and whatnot, he admitted that he was a virgin, right?
Correct.
At one point. I know that I heard that. I saw it somewhere. I know. There he goes in prison for pretty much a lifetime, right? Because he only has a possibility of parole. That doesn't guarantee him that he's going to get out, right?
2048.
Exactly. At age 56 or something. And he is sitting in prison for something that he did not do. And he would need to register as a sexual predator, right? Offender.
That's correct. As a sex offender, correct.
Poor thing, a virgin. Doesn't your heart just break for that?
I find it very difficult to talk about Brendan Dassey, because it's sheer, utter stupidity that the two senior investigators in Fassbender and Uyghur, a judge and a jury, could not see the complete bullshit in what Brendan Dassey was telling him. And that to me is very, very frightening and scary. Now, I understand that there was forensic evidence against Stephen. I understand that because Stephen is going with a planting scenario. But clearly the planters were not thinking about Brendan Dassey, because nothing pointed to Brendan Dassey. The poor kid implicated himself into something he never did. and he likely would die in prison for something he
Yeah.
never did. And no one has got the balls to admit that they made a mistake.
Yeah.
Neville, do you have
Crockett Thompson,
final
yes. Crockett Thompson has a good question. He goes, I want to know who Brandon assisted in mutilation, because Stephen was exonerated of that.
correct.
Not exonerated, but yeah.
Yep, they found him not guilty of mutilation of a corpse, which is rather bizarre because there's no doubt that Teresa Halbach, or the victim, if you don't believe it was Teresa, was dismembered because there are saw cuts in bones. So she was cut to pieces. But Brendan Dassey never said that they had chopped up Teresa Halbach. Brendan said that they put Teresa Halbach whole in the burn pit. That straight away, that completely destroyed his story. Jack 61.
Going back just a few minutes to the conversation we were having about Teresa, the burn pit, the bones, the burning. I'm reminded of this phone call as one of the more recent ones that we got between Remaker and Todd Herman. They were throwing Singlab under the bus, but Remaker's talking about him and Link going to see Avery, and Remaker's like, my gut feeling is he didn't have anything to do with it. He was very matter of fact about it.
That's 100% correct. Yep, correct. So somehow after the finding of the RAV4, everything 100% changed, right? All right. So guys, let's get back to item FL. So after the March 2nd press conference, in which Mr. Kratz basically broke about 3 or 4 or 5 rules and regulations about press conferences, he basically gave out the scenario about what happened to Teresa Halbach. As a result of this, they were able to get another search warrant and go inside the garage. And it's interesting that Lenk happened to be there as well. Well, lo and behold, they rechecked the garage again, and I believe it was Special Agent Kevin Heimer who went on his hands and knees and under the green compressor in the garage found a bullet fragment. That bullet fragment is entitled Item FL, but also they found another bullet fragment entitled Item FK. So they found 2 bullet fragments. Now, isn't that interesting? Because in the previous searches of the garage, Jack 61, did they find any bullet fragments at all in the previous searches of the garage?
No, just the shell casings, as I recall. They had like 10 or 11 shell casings that they collected in November. No bullet fragments that I'm aware of.
No bullet fragments, but they found, I think, several shell casings. Now, if you're on a farm and you're shooting rabbits, gophers, is it unusual to find shell casings on a salvage yard? Is it? And Neville?
No. Heck no. Rolly Johnson said that he must have shot 3,000 rounds in that place. 3,000.
That's correct.
So they're everywhere.
That's correct. The actual owner of the rifle was Roland Johnson. He actually owned that rifle and another gun that was present in Stephen Avery's trailer in his bedroom. And Roland Johnson admitted to firing, as Neville said, around about 3,000 rounds all around the property, including the garage. So Stephen used to complain that when he cut the grass, he had to pick up the shell casings because otherwise the blades of the lawnmower would shoot off the cartridges. So finding shell casings in the garage or around the garage was no big deal at all. However, on March the 2nd, they found Item FL and Item FK. Now, Jack 61, are you able to put up some of those slides that I gave you?
Yes, let me get this. Let me get these others up on the screen. I'll pop them out.
No hassles. So the searchers came back in the garage, and now all of a sudden they found 2 bullet fragments, Item FL and Item FK. Now, both item FL and item FK were sent to the crime lab. Now, remember, the item FL and item FK would have been examined, first of all, to determine the type of bullet that it was, etc., etc. And then finally, it would have been given to Cherie Culhane. Now, if you have a look at this diagram that I've got up on screen, you can see the bullet fragment item FL that was found underneath the compressor. Now, as you can see, item FL appears to be very, very clean, but according to the state, Teresa Horbach was shot on October the 31st. So that means that that bullet somehow magically was unseen from October 31st all the way to March the 2nd, right? And so miraculously, item FL and item FK was found on March the 2nd after Wiegert had said to Brendan, who shot her in the head. So these crack investigators never found item FL or item FK in that garage. So they found it on March the 2nd. Eventually, that bullet fragments got to Cherie Culhane. And as you can see here, this is when the shenanigans commence. Cherie Culhane was able to get very, very close. There were two alleles that didn't come up. They were low abundance. She was able to get a robust, almost full profile, genomic DNA profile of Teresa Horbach on item FL, right? So that meant that somehow Teresa Horbach's DNA ended up on item FL. Now, when the interesting thing is this, when Cherie Culhane had examined that bullet, she stated that she saw no presence of blood, tissue, anything on that bullet. So that begs the question, what is the source of the DNA on that bullet, right? So in summary, on March the 2nd, the investigators were able to find two bullet fragments, item FL, item FK. Cherie Culhane did not notice any blood on those bullet fragments, but she was able to obtain a full genomic PCR profile that belonged to Teresa Horbach on that bullet. Jack 61, can we have the next slide? We'll just wait till that pops up. Okay, now the big problem is this. So what's the big problem? The big problem is that Cherie Culhane was able to contaminate the PCR negative control with her own genomic DNA. So when she extracted the DNA from the bullet, she was able to get Teresa Horbach's profile. However, when she ran the PCR negative control, she was able to pick up her own genomic DNA profile in the PCR control. And I quote, what did that mean? Answer, that means that during the extraction procedure, I inadvertently introduced my own DNA into the negative control. Oh dear. So Jack 61, are you able to shift it closer more to the right-hand side? Because if we have a look at the contamination log, so what happens is this. When a contamination event occurs in the laboratory, they have to report it in a book. And as you can see, Cherie Culhane reported the contamination of the bullet. We know that it's the Stephen Avery case because of the case number. And it said here, no sample to re-extract, right? Now notice, cleaned area and no sample to re-extract, right? But she reported the profile. So the profile that she got in the PCR negative control was her own DNA. Now, this was a huge problem. Jack 61, can we have the next slide, please? So how was Cherie Cohen going to, can you blow that up a little bit, Jack 61? Especially the area that's in the red square down below. Okay, so we had a real big problem. Because the negative control was contaminated, she had to get a deviation request form. So she even states, Cohen states, that if you contaminate a negative PCR control, you normally would have to re-extract the DNA sample. You throw away all the results and you do another re-extraction. Well, guys, the problem is Cherie Cohen had utilized all the DNA from item FL. So what she did was she washed the bullet in a buffer and had utilized all the DNA from that sample, which meant she was not able to re-extract and do the experiment again, which meant she had to get a deviation request form in order to present the information. But there's one problem. Such a request form can only be used for exclusionary purposes. Cherie Cohen wanted to use it for inclusionary purposes. And if you have a look on the form, it's got the signature of de Groot. That's another laboratory member, another laboratory technician in another lab. In order to get this form authenticated and authorized, she actually needed the signature of her own laboratory supervisor, Mary Variali. So that meant that the form itself was not fit for purpose because it was not properly signed by her supervisor. It's like you at your work telling your colleague, oh, look, I'm going to go on 2 weeks holiday. What do you think? And your work colleague goes, oh, yeah, no problems. And you go on 2 weeks holidays without telling your boss or the secretary who keeps a record. So therefore, this particular deviation request form was not only illegal, it was not fit for purpose, right? So somehow she was able to present item FL to the jury and to the judge. And the judge clearly did not understand the importance of a negative control. So normally, if a negative control is contaminated, her own laboratory manual said, you throw the experiment out and you redo it again. Cohen had utilized all the DNA of the bullet. By the way, guys, what else did she utilize all the DNA from as well? What other forensic piece of evidence? Jack 61.
The key.
The key. So Cohen utilized all the DNA from the key and the bullet. And I think Neverly alluded to, what did Fassbender ask her to do? Try to put her in the garage or the trailer. And in essence, that's exactly what Cohen did. The key that had only Stephen Avery's DNA on it, and the bullet that only had Teresa Horbach's DNA on it as well. Now, think about it, guys. That bullet was meant to be sitting on a concrete floor in dust and dirt for months, right? For months. And one problem is DNA is very sensitive to the environment. If there's dust, dirt, bacteria, you're going to start degrading your DNA and breaking it down. Yet, Cohen, despite this bullet allegedly going through Teresa Horbach, had a robust DNA profile that Cohen was able to extract from. Truly, truly remarkable. And does anyone remember what Norm Gunn said during the press conference? What did he say about how Ida Mafel somehow was able to get through into the court? Does anyone remember what Garn said? Jack 61.
You got to use common sense with DNA. I mean, come on. It's that's just what we do. And I believe this was a common sense thing.
Correct. Correct.
Man.
So, in other words, Norm Garn just destroyed over 100 years of scientific principles. And he said, don't worry about positive and negative controls. I'm sure the jury will allow it and understand, and same with the judge. Don't worry about it. So hence, Ida Mafel got placed into evidence. And trust me, this had a devastating consequence to Stephen Avery. Because it now, guys, you've got to understand, it now meant that what Brendan Dassey said, the fact that they had shot Teresa Halbach, and the fact that they had cranial bone fragments that had beveling and proof of a bullet going through the skull, it meant that what Brendan Dassey actually said was true, because Ida Mafel basically closed the circle. It closed the loop. It meant that, oh my God, Stephen Avery did shoot Teresa Halbach in the skull and kill her in the garage. So everything now made sense. Jack 61.
And Christ was able to do this throughout this 20-day trial, and he never said the words that Stephen and Brendan had used the gun and fired out of MFL. He never said that himself. He was able to pull that shit off.
That's correct, and that's a very, very good point. And this is where I'm driving to, how the state effectively used Ida Mafel to hang Stephen and ultimately Brendan. But Jack 61 is correct. Ken Kratz never said that Ida Mafel went through Teresa Halbach's skull, right? That's 100% true. But the damage was done because the jury, and I'm sure the judge, got the impression that Ida Mafel was the bullet that had killed Teresa Halbach. Because remember what Dr. Eisenberg said, Teresa Halbach died as a result of homicidal violence, right? And the evidence suggested that Teresa Halbach was shot at least once in the back of the skull and again on the left-hand side temple. So it all started coming together nicely. And how many bullet fragments did they find? 2. Ida Mafel and Ida Mafk. So you do the sums. You connect the dots. 2 cranial bone fragments, 2 bullet fragments. Teresa Halbach died as a result of homicidal violence. Done. Stephen Avery was done. Done like a dinner, right? Even though in the trial, Ken Kratz never said Ida Mafel or Ida Mafk had struck Teresa Halbach in the skull, but it was implied. Neville, do you have a comment?
Dr. Silkman, didn't we read that Kratz said, I was very careful not to say that?
100% correct.
Something? Yeah.
100% correct. And in actual fact, once we actually start the podcast proper and do a couple of the questions, you'll see how devious Ken Kratz was and how disgusting the state were during the trial, how they effectively used Ida Mafel to entrap Stephen Avery and Brendan Dassey without actually stating it. It was a very, very clever trick. All right, Jack 61, do you have another slide? We'll just wait. So yeah, this is the infamous phone call that Fassbender phoned up Cherie Cohen. Now, look at the date. Look at the date of that call. It is very early on in the investigation, on the 11th of November. So we have the lead investigator phoning up the very person who did all the swabbing, all the PCR analysis, and Fassbender asked Cherie Cohen, tried to put her in his house or garage. Now, guys, I want to ask the panel, is this typical, or does this display some type of bias? Alice, can I have a comment from you? Is this normal? Alice?
No, it's not normal. It's not normal. Definitely not. I mean, especially telling somebody to put somebody somewhere where they're not. You know what I mean? It's just, and if they can do something like that, or just to say something like that, you know, put him in the garage, or her in the garage, or whatever, what else are they capable of? You know? And I wouldn't trust any of them. Any of them.
100%
We got
correct.
Fassbender, Kratz, the lot. I wouldn't trust any of them as far as I could throw them.
Correct. Now, why did Cohen write it down?
Because she's stupid.
Yeah, but also, can you see it as a form of insurance policy?
Yes, yeah. They made me do it.
They made me do it. They made me do it. They requested this, and I gave them what they wanted, right? So that's a form of insurance policy right there. So, guys, think about it. Very early on in the investigation, you've got the lead investigator telling the lead technician who's handling all the forensic evidence his wish list. Jack 61. Do you think this is a legitimate thing to do?
Absolutely not. There should be absolutely no. I mean, other than to call and say, you know, want to ensure that, you know, we left some standards or some samples, get to them as quickly as you can. Thank you very much. That's it. He gave her a direction. He gave her told her to make an action. I'm saying it wrong. He told her to do something. Try to place her in her in the house or the garage. That's a direction. And it's biased.
That is a direction. So in a way, guys, there's already inherent bias, right? So I don't recall. Do you think that's a normal thing that an investigator should tell a DNA lab tech?
Not at all. If that should have convinced him, if you know, along with all the other fishy stuff in this case, the jury, I mean.
100% correct. So if you're a judge and you saw this, what would you do? What would you normally do? Anybody? If you saw this in a court, Jack 60, I don't recall. Do you have a comment?
Wouldn't allow it to be used. It would be excluded, but you know, anything that, well, I don't know, anything that was come from that, you know?
Yeah, well, put it this way. All the forensic evidence, all the handling was done by Cherie Cohen. So if the judge said, well, everything you've touched is inadmissible, I want it redone again, doesn't that amount to a mistrial?
Yeah, they'd have a problem, a big problem, and they should have.
Correct. But did Judge Willis do anything about it? No.
Probably failed to see the relevance.
He failed to see the relevance. Correct. Jack 61.
You know, in reality, they shouldn't be able to call at all. I misspoke, and I did that just if he's going to have any contact at all with a lab. But the truth is, it should be a blind. It should be blind testing, or double blind even.
100% correct. There should be no contact between the investigators and the people handling the forensic evidence. In actual fact, guys, Shariko Haynes should have been the last person to have touched anything pertaining to Stephen Avery, because Shariko Haynes had a long history with Stephen Avery. Plus, Shariko Haynes got him in prison in 1985 with the hair evidence that convinced the judge and a jury. Shariko Haynes did the analysis on the pubic hair, which led to Stephen Avery being exonerated, which led Stephen Avery coming up with a $36 million civil suit. So in essence, Shariko Haynes owed the state. Guys, am I being fair or too harsh? Alice?
No, you're being absolutely fair, Doc, because that's what I said earlier on. You know, she's the one that got him out of the jail. So because she got him out on DNA, that gave him the ability to sue the state for $36 million. If she hadn't got him out of jail on DNA, then he would still be in there, so he wouldn't be suing the state for $36 million. So in the state's eyes, she owed them one, because it was her fault that he got out of the jail in the first place. But then, if you want to look at another way, and I know it is not this situation whatsoever because of everything else that I know, but if I was a newbie or whatever to this case, you could maybe think that she wrote that statement, put her in the garage or whatever, to try and cover her aim back, as we says, you know, in a logical sense. Oh, right, they're documenting this because they've told me to do something that I'm not supposed to do, so I should write this down.
That's correct. That's incorrect.
Yeah, but we know that that's not the case at all, even though we would like to think it. That is not the case at all. It's the simple fact is what we says. She owed the state because she's the one that got him out, and because she got him out, they could sue for $36 million. That's why they got him on DNA this time, because it got him out last time. They were damn sure it wasn't going to get him out this time.
And they didn't want a rerun of the 1985 case. They wanted to make sure that this time it was airtight. So DNA evidence got him out. DNA evidence got him back in. And don't ever forget the words of Jean Couchet, who said during his civil deposition about DNA evidence being manipulated and fake.
Yeah.
Right? That is extremely damning. And think about this, right? One thing that Buting did was he complained about the Wisconsin State Crime Lab and all the shenanigans that took place in that crime lab, including someone being sanctioned for being drunk on duty. And this was during the Stephen Avery trial. Now, the one lab tech that did all the analysis during the Stephen Avery trial was Shariko Haynes. So wait a minute. If it was Shariko Haynes who was intoxicated while working, that to me is a huge, huge problem. She's handling forensic evidence. She's handling DNA. It's very, very easy to cross-contaminate samples or deliberately add DNA to tubes to get the result that you're after. Now, are you trying to tell me that you trust someone potentially who was intoxicated at the workbench? Neverly, do you have a comment?
Not only contaminate, but also throw it out, use it up. So
correct.
The defense cannot come back and ask for it to retest it.
Right, and thank you, Neverly. And the important thing is this: Buting and Strang had written a request to supervise and go in the laboratory and watch the forensic evidence being processed. The state refused. And you know what their argument was, why they didn't want Buting and Strang in the laboratory? Who could remember? Who could remember?
Yeah.
Who could remember what the reason was?
Oh, how can we forget?
Contamination.
Correct. Contamination. So their argument was, Buting and Strang, you can't come into the lab because you're going to potentially contaminate our samples. Now, listen to this. Culhane contaminated the PCR negative control. That's a fact because her own profile came up. She was asked in court, how did this possibly happen? She said that she was training 2 new technicians. And as a result of training the technicians, she got her own genomic DNA inside the PCR negative control. Now, wait a sec. You are handling potentially the most important piece of forensic evidence outside the RAV4, and you are teaching 2 new students how to do DNA techniques in the middle of a murder trial. I call bullshit. I reckon that was an excuse and a reason that Culhane used to come up with how she contaminated a PCR negative control. Alice, do you have a comment?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with you, Doc. I mean, she had 20 odd years experience, and not once does she have to avert to the protocol thing, you know, and for her to all of a sudden do it. Just be talking about the somebody being on something in the lab. I mean, you've just got to look at that the one that we've all seen, How to Fix a Drug Scandal, you know, and
Correct.
that was the crime lab assistant who was actually taking the MDMA and everything like that.
Correct.
That was in the crime lab,
That's
taking
correct.
it themselves and then doing tests.
That's correct.
You know what I mean? Out their face, you know? And a lot of the cases had to get overturned because the evidence couldn't be relied on because the lab tech was out her face. You know what I mean? Can you imagine if it was Sherry Cocaine that it came out that it was Sherry Cocaine that was drunk on duty?
Correct.
This case would have been flung out and it would have went nowhere.
That's 100% correct. And in the case that you were talking about, the drug scandal, Jack 61, let us know how many cases had to be thrown out. How many criminal cases had to be thrown out?
It was at least 10,000 if my memory serves.
10,000 criminal cases had to be thrown out because one laboratory technician was dry labbing. That is, she was making up the results without doing any testing. And the other laboratory technician was actually taking all the drugs herself and was high as a kite constantly, which meant that all the results of 10,000 cases had to be overturned, right? Now, how on earth can any judge listen to this? How can any judge listen to this and not toss the case right out then and there? Jack 61.
You know, and I know I'm probably I don't know limb here, but I've often wondered that because Culhane had so much pressure put on her that she contaminated that sample on purpose. I don't know that. I've just thought about it.
Well, put it this way. It was their case. It was the most important piece of forensic evidence because
a game changer.
Yes, because what it did, it actually placed Teresa Horbach physically inside that garage,
Right.
which then meant the story that Brendan Dassey was saying was indeed true. But those bastards in trial deliberately never said that IDMFL was the instrument of death because they knew they had no proof that IDMFL hit skull bone. They knew it, but they never said it. But the judge and the jury thought, oh my God, she was killed in that garage. So all the things that occurred to her previously had to be true. And we'll see that it was all bullshit from start to finish. Alice, do you have a comment?
It's Pete Moss in chat. He says, is there any evidence that proves there was any training taking place?
Not as far as I'm aware. Now, I know that, look, when you're in a laboratory, I've seen, and I've done PCR myself, when you're doing PCR, you've got to be absolutely anally retained. You have to be anal retentive in cleanliness. You have to make sure that you minimize contamination to an absolute minimum. You do certain parts of the experiment in one part of the laboratory, you do another part of the experiment in another part of the laboratory, and only the person handling the material is permitted to be there. You never allow bystanders to be over your shoulder while you're doing a PCR experiment, for the sole purpose that all you need to do is introduce a few of your cells into a tube or on a piece of equipment, and you're going to amplify up your own DNA, right? You have to be extremely clean. Otherwise, your results are going to be contaminated. Now, it doesn't matter that contamination took place. The purpose of contamination is to tell you, hey, no problems. The PCR negative control was contaminated. That's okay. Throw everything out. You cannot draw any conclusions. Redo the experiment again. But there's one problem. Culhane, in her wisdom, decided to use all of the DNA in one hit. You never, ever do that in an experiment. You always save at least half, because just in case things go belly up, you've got a backup. You can redo the experiment again. So in essence, what Cherie Culhane should have said in court, I cannot bring this as evidence because I contaminated the negative control. I had no chance of redoing the experiment. I can draw no conclusion from item FL. That was the way she should have answered. However, she knew that her career and the case was on the line. Her career and the case was on the line if she could not submit item FL. So that, in my opinion, convinced the judge and the jury that Teresa Horbach was indeed murdered in Stephen Avery's garage. Neverly, did you have a comment? Neverly, did you have a comment?
Yeah, as you said, while working in the lab and doing such a thing as DNA profiling and whatnot, you have to be very clean, sterile, under sterile conditions, which means
Correct.
nothing moves. You know, there's air control in the room. There's all
That's
these
100% correct.
parameters that need to be
100%
monitored, right?
100%
So under
correct.
sterile conditions. So, and then she does what she does, right? Messes
Correct.
it all up. And then
Correct.
that snake serpent gone to go out and to say publicly, well, you know, when you're dealing with such sensitive technology, you have to leave room for some common sense. And it's like, huh? You just
100%
contradicted
correct.
yourself, you viper, you.
Yeah, and I must admit,
Unbelievable.
to me,
Unbelievable.
yes, Neverly, to me, this was the turning point where I became extremely interested in the case, when I could not believe the bullshit that went down regarding DNA and the forensic evidence. I could not believe what I was listening to. It was
I
truly
was gonna chuck
unbelievable.
my phone at the TV.
I think I did.
Yeah.
I think I did chuck my iPad.
Yeah.
But
Unbelievable.
Jack61 has put a very interesting picture up on YouTube. So, okay. Now, I am very glad that item FL was actually submitted into court, because now this revealed the shenanigans of Culhane, the crime lab, and the state perfectly. And so what Zellner did was she was able to get item FL. and she was able to give item FL to Dr. Chris Palanek. Now, he's a forensic expert and he does trace analysis. Now, you've got to understand that Zona had no idea what was going to be on item FL. She had no idea. So she took a big risk by obtaining item FL and getting it examined. Now, what you see here is item FL under high magnification, right? And unbelievable as it seems, you find no presence of blood, because remember, they can do trace analysis. They can determine whether a bullet fragment has got blood, whether it's got tissue, whether it's got bone, because bone is made up of calcium and phosphorus. By placing the bullet under a special microscope and doing various types of analysis, chemical analysis, you can determine the chemical composition of that bullet. When Dr. Chris Palanek examined the bullet under high-powered microscope, now remember, this was done after the trial. The judge and the jury had no idea about item FL. What was discovered was that item FL had shards of wood embedded into the surface of the bullet. It also had red paint, and it also had cotton fibers, right? Now, to make matters worse, what Zellner did was she employed the services of Luke Haig. Jack 61, so these are closer up images of item FL. And what you can see are many fragments or shards of wood, right? So for wood to be embedded into the lead of a bullet, it means that the bullet had to have struck at high velocity a wooden surface, right? There is no way that a bullet is going to bounce off concrete and then embed itself into a wooden structure, right? So this bullet, item FL, had struck a wooden object somewhere in that garage at high velocity. Jack 61, do we have any other pictures that you've got? And this is the tip of item FL. And as you can see here, what Dr. Chris Palanek found was the presence of wax, wood, and also cotton fibers, right? But what is remarkable here is that what Zellner did is she employed the services of Luke Haig, right? So what Luke Haig did was that he set up a mock head, human head, and he used bovine scapulars. And the bovine scapulars have got regions on them which are as thick as a human skull. And he put ballistic gel between two bovine scapulars to simulate the head. And what he did was he used .22 bullets and he shot into the bovine scapulars. And what he found out was that the energy of the bullet diminished very, very quickly. In other words, the bullet didn't have enough energy for a through and through shot. It lost energy very, very quickly. But the most amazing thing was, Jack 61, can we have the next picture if you got it? So Luke Haig had shot, this is the top of item FL, showing the presence of wood, wax, red paint, and cotton fibers. Do you have any more pictures at Jack 61? That's a magnification showing the presence of the wood. Oh yeah, this one. So what Dr. Palanek did was he took the exemplar bullets from Luke Haig that he shot through the bovine scapulars. And what they did is they tried to extract they put the bullet in the same type of extraction buffer that Shariko Hain did. And then they examined the bullet under a high-powered microscope. This was damning because what they found was, despite the bullet being washed in a DNA buffer, the bullet head, the soft lead, had bone shards. So in other words, when a bullet traverses your skull or hits bone, it's going to be embedded with bone shards, right? So he used special microscopy to prove that those fragments in the lead bullet were indeed bone fragments because it was rich in calcium and phosphorus, and these are two chemicals which are present in high amounts in bone. So therefore, if a bullet goes through skull, if a bullet hits bone, it picks up bone shards, bone fragments. There's only one problem with item FL, right? The problem with item FL is that it contained no bone shards, right? Which means that item FL never struck Teresa Halbach in the skull. Item FL never was the cause of death of Teresa Halbach, right? So hence, even though item FL was traced back to the gun that was present in Stephen Avery's trailer, it very likely meant that the person who had fired item FL was Roland Johnson, who had admitted firing at least 3,000 rounds from that gun, from that rifle. It wasn't Stephen Avery. It was Roland Johnson. And all the evidence points to the fact that item FL never struck Teresa Halbach. Item FL hit the wood wall of the garage and likely fell out on the ground as a result of jackhammering. So the vibration could have meant that item FL had fallen down from the wall, right? So this was a big, important point for Kathleen Zellner, that item FL was not the bullet that had killed Teresa Halbach through homicidal violence. It had nothing to do with Teresa Halbach and was potentially very, very damaging for the state. But the way Ken Kratz and the state went around item FL was truly remarkable. Jack 61, do you have any more pictures? So item FL contains no bone shards. It contains wood. And to prove it, when you're doing science, what you need to do, forensic science, is to try and reproduce the crime scene. So what Kathleen Zellner did was fire .22 bullets into Stephen Avery's garage, which is made of wood. And there's also there are red surfaces in Stephen Avery's garage, and there are metal objects that are red as well. So Kathleen Zellner fired .22 bullets into the wooden garage, and she was able to compare the bullets that she fired to item FL, and both item FL and the bullets that she fired were the same. So she was able to reproduce item FL. And when her crew went into the garage, I think Jack 61 just showed up a high magnification picture. There were bullet holes in the garage wall, right? Which is exactly what you would get if you fired item FL into the garage from outside to inside, right? It goes through wood, and as you can see, the garage is made up of paneling. And Dr. Chris Palanek said that the wood, there were different types of wood. One was more solid, one looked like it had been manufactured. So Kathleen Zellner was able to reproduce item FL by simply shooting bullets through Stephen Avery's garage. Now think about it, guys. I want to ask my panel and also the people in chat. What would have happened if this evidence was presented back in 2005 by Dr. Chris Palanek to say, I'm sorry, but item FL never went through a human being. It never struck skull. It went through Stephen Avery's garage. Jack 61.
Exoneration. Case closed.
Look, all jokes aside, the whole case, the state's case would have completely crumbled because they were building up this story that, oh my God, what Brendan said was in actual fact true. They'd shot Teresa Halbach and the cranial bone fragments proved that she was shot at least twice. So as you can see the picture here, this is truly remarkable. Item FL and Kathleen Zellner's exemplar bullets closely resemble each other in terms of they both contain embedded pieces of wood. That's exactly what happens when a high-velocity bullet strikes wood, not bone. So item FL cannot be connected to Teresa Halbach. But here's the problem, guys. How does the state now account for how on earth Teresa Halbach's bullet, a DNA is found on a bullet that had struck wood and likely red paint, a red painted surface at high velocity? Alice.
Yeah, we've got a couple of questions. Katie is asking, is Culhane still in the crime lab?
I'm not sure whether she's still working there or not. I know that when Zellner went to visit her with Reich, she was still working there. She was still there. She's the one that handed over the evidence. And if I was Culhane, I would be extremely nervous. So I don't know if she's still working there. She would be in her 60s. I'm not sure whether she's there still or not, but that's very interesting. Anything else, Alice?
Yeah. Pete Moss is asking, how many bullets does a .22 cartridge hold? Did Stephen have to reload to fire 10 shots?
I think the Marlin rifle, I'm not sure whether it was single shot or not. I'll have to check that. I don't know whether it was semi-automatic and you could have put in like a type of cartridge. I think it was single shot. Jack 61.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. I know some 22s you can buy. It's like a
holder.
A holder that goes up underneath. It would normally come with that, but you can load it with 10 or 20 shells in a clip. And like I said, it's a semi-automatic. But I don't know about that Marlin rifle. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I don't see any evidence of a clip. So that's a very good question. So it could well be single loaded. So could you imagine if it was a single loaded gun, Stephen Avery loading 10 or 11 bullets and deciding to shoot Teresa Halbach 11 times after, remember, she's been had her throat cut, she's been stabbed in the stomach, all sorts of things, shot twice in the head, that Stephen would now load another additional 8 or 9 bullets and shoot Teresa Halbach's dead corpse, and then decide then to chop her up. It makes no sense whatsoever. Okay, so this slide here is, you got to read it. It's truly remarkable. And I quote, this is Buting questioning Cherie Culhane. I quote, let's close with this. Other than that bullet, all your other tests, none of them put Teresa Halbach ever in his garage or his house or any of his vehicles, right? Correct. Now, think about this. Are we to believe that this horrendous, horrible crime, which involved shooting, stabbing, cutting, dismemberment, cremation, that the only presence of DNA outside the RAV4 was on item FL that belonged to Teresa Hallbach? None in the trailer, none between the trailer and the garage, none between the garage and the burn pit, none in the trailer. The only presence of DNA from Teresa Hallbach is on item FL. The very, very bullet test where Cherie Cohen had contaminated the negative PCR control. Alice, do you have a comment?
No, it's actually TJ Anderson. Welcome, TJ. Thanks for joining us. He's asking, I have a question about the bones with the alleles. If some of the alleles were burned off, does that still eliminate another relative of Karen Hallbach besides Teresa?
No. You got to understand, and let me try and explain it. Thank you very much for that question. When you extract genomic DNA from cells, or say from a tissue sample like liver, you have to be extremely careful when you extract genomic DNA. Genomic DNA is an extremely long molecule. Any form of rough handling or manipulation will damage the DNA. So when you do PCR analysis, you amplify specific regions all over the genome, not one spot, right? So if the DNA is intact, you amplify 15 loci, no problems at all. However, if you expose tissue like muscle to heat, you degrade the cells and you damage the DNA. You can still extract the genomic DNA. All the alleles are there, no problems, but the DNA has become fragmented. If the region that you're trying to amplify has been damaged by heat, so in other words, the damage by heat is random, if you try and amplify that region, you may get a very, very little amount of amplification or none at all. So when you run this on a special gel, if the DNA peak is too low, you have to discount it. You cannot count it as part of a result. So what Cohen needed to do was to try and re-extract the genomic DNA, do a brand new prep, because my understanding was that there were several pieces of tissue, not just the one. So go back and re-extract the genomic DNA, see if you can get a better result. Of course, what we could have done now in 2022 is use more fancy techniques and get a full genomic DNA profile, because they use different PCR primers and it's much more sensitive, right? You could also do mitochondrial analysis. You can do other types of analysis. So it's not that the alleles disappeared, it's because the genomic DNA was fragmented and damaged by heat. Perfectly normal. Jack 61, thank you so much for that question. Excellent question. Jack 61.
Yeah, this is, just a bit anal, I guess, but you were naming off everything that inside the house and the garage, or the trailer in the garage. I just wanted to point out that not only did they not find anything there, but speaking specifically about the handcuffs that she was allegedly bound up in, nothing there. Found Stephen and Jody's DNA. So, and then also this stabbing that allegedly occurred in throat slicing. There's no DNA on any nails found. Nothing.
Correct.
Oh,
so,
and she also didn't. That's okay. Didn't Cohen also say she found a few nucleated cells? Isn't that what she called it on the bullet?
No. She only said that she was asked, well, what's the source of the DNA? You didn't see any blood. She goes, it has to be nucleated cells.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Cherie Cohen, because nucleated cells have got DNA in them. right? So in other words, she was not able to give a source of where the genomic DNA came from, right? But I want to close with this. Because remember, Judge Angie and when the state gave their response, they dismissed item FL. They threw it out, right? And have a look at what they said. This is truly remarkable. A quote, Avery has misunderstood why item FL was significant. Item FL was significant because it was both fired from the gun in Avery's bedroom and had Teresa Hallpark's DNA on it. Note the following, meaning the bullet touched some part of Miss Hallpark's tissue at some point and therefore linked the gun to Miss Hallpark's murder. Boom. Done. So the state didn't care that it wasn't the bullet that killed Teresa Hallpark. The state is saying, oh, it just happened to be a bullet that transited through Teresa Hallpark, left no blood, no tissue, no nothing, and bounced from the concrete and hit a wall at full velocity such that it had Teresa Hallpark's DNA magically on it and wood and red paint and wax. That's exactly what the state is saying, because now the state is going, oh shit, it wasn't the bullet that had killed Teresa Hallpark. How are we going to now still try and make item FL relevant? Okay, it went through her. Now, guys in the panel, what's your feeling and understanding about that? Alice, do you have a comment? It's not the bullet that killed Teresa Hallpark, but it magically transited her body. Alice, do you have a comment?
Yeah, well, it's just like in JFK, Doc. There was a magic bullet that magically found its way to Teresa's body, some part of Teresa's body, to get this tissue on it. You know, it's just bloody ludicrous what these people have tried to do.
Correct.
It's just, you know, for a Glaswegian, Doc, I'm actually running out of words to say about this frigging case.
I've lost all my hair and I've lost all my sanity. And we haven't even started talking about Johnny Depp and Amber.
I know.
Don't start, whatever you do. I don't recall. What do you think about what the state just said, their response about item FL, that it transited through Teresa Hallpark's body, not striking one bone? I don't recall.
It's another MAM miracle, as Jeff Jones would say.
Yeah, correct. Another man miracle, correct. Jack 61.
Well, you know me, Doc. It's just complete bullshit, because now they've got on their backwards bicycle and pedaling hard, hoping people will swallow this new part of the story. I don't believe one word of it. They know they're caught. Culhane's caught too. She's targeted.
Yes.
I mean, she's screwed.
This Jack 61. That's a very important point. This now puts the spotlight directly on Culhane, because we now have a bullet that's got no presence of blood. They got no idea where the DNA came from, right? They know it did not strike bone. It did not strike skull. It was not responsible for any of those two cranial bone fragments, the beveling. Now Culhane and the state have to explain, bloody hell, how in the hell did it end up with Teresa's DNA on it if it never struck bone and it struck wood? So they've got to come up with a hypothesis. Oh, no problems. It went through Teresa Halbach and it didn't strike any bone, and it came out of her. Somehow it bounced and it ended up striking wood. So now these guys, Jack 61, are backpedaling at 100 miles an hour. They got caught with their pants down. And to make matters worse, we know that Culhane was handling Teresa Halbach's DNA at her workbench. She had a contamination event because she contaminated the negative control. So who's to say that she didn't deliberately or accidentally contaminate the tube containing the bullet? Jack 61.
That's exactly what I was going to say. I was going to add to that. She already fucked up her one test, the control sample, the negative control. Who's to say she didn't fuck this other one up too? Because she didn't. She had her Teresa's DNA at her workstation. So, and also, Doc, I wanted to say hello, little sister, Jess Rhonda, and
Hey,
she's a new member of the Foul Play Lovers membership.
fantastic. Just Rhonda, welcome.
I'm sorry, I started working and I'm not used to working, and so I fell asleep just as we got started, and so I need to get back into my working vibe.
No worries. Unfortunately, the jury and the judge fell asleep too, right?
Yeah, right.
Which had devastating consequences. But look, welcome. Thank you, Just Rhonda.
You bet.
So, any ideas about item FL? How the DNA got on that bullet?
You asking me?
Yes. Any idea how that DNA got on that bullet?
I don't believe there was any DNA on that bullet, personally.
Interesting. Correct. That's a very good point. Neverly, thank you, Just Rhonda. Neverly, any idea how item FL just happened to have Teresa Halbach's DNA on it?
Oh, sorry, I was talking while I was mute.
No worries.
It is a magic bullet. It is to prove that the state will do anything, and I underline, italicize, highlight the word anything to preserve the verdict.
Correct.
They will bend themselves into a pretzel. They will not look for the truth, actually. And if this is logical to them, then it's really disheartening, mind you, frustrating and whatever, but really disheartening and so scary to see what kind of proof you need to present in order to get yourself out or to be, acquitted.
Correct.
Because they're really, really, really taking, aliens did it type of thing.
Correct. It's
So
complete.
that tells me that they're not interested in helping people get out, and that Gunn's little philosophy of common sense does not apply in the court of law, or but it did apply for that case for him. I'm just like speechless today. I've been really triggered every 5 minutes, and I'm trying to keep quiet because it's such bullshit and atrocity, actually. Atrocity, because this is not an isolated case. We know that.
It is absolutely correct. Thank you very much, Neverly. So you can see what the state actually did, right? The state was very, very clever when it came to item FL because it gave legitimacy to what Brendan Dassey had told the investigators, despite Wiegert mentioning the shooting scenario, not Brendan Dassey. So remember, the jury are hearing all of this. They are hearing from Dr. Eisenberg. We found cranial bone fragments that had beveling in it. We x-rayed them. They had flecks in them. We then have the gun handler who looked at the rifle that said, I can prove that item FL was shot by the rifle that was present in Stephen Avery's bedroom, right? And I have no disagreements with that because a rifle's barrel has got grooves and landing in it. When a bullet goes through a barrel, it produces a significant, it produces a signature on it, right? Marks on it. So you can place a bullet in a barrel. Plus, they do test firing and compare the landing and grooves on the bullet. There's no doubt that Ida Mafel was shot by the rifle in Stephen Avery's bedroom. That rifle didn't belong to Stephen. It belonged to Roland Johnson, who admitted in a court of law that he had fired at least 3,000 rounds from that gun. Furthermore, all around the salvage yard and around the garage, and likely in the garage as well. So no big deal, right? But the judge and the jury are hearing the cranial bone fragments, the beveling in the cranial bone fragments, the fact that they searched the garage and on March the 2nd they find 2 bullet fragments, item FL, item FK. And then finally they hear, oh, item FL just happened to have Teresa Halbach's DNA on it. Boom. So the jury and the judge make the connection that item FL is connected to the cranial bone fragments, which is connected to the death of Teresa Halbach, especially when Dr. Jensen gets up on the stand and says, I was told that item FL had the decedent's blood on it. Does anyone remember that? Who remembers Dr. Jensen saying that he was told and informed that item FL had Teresa Halbach's blood on it? Who remembers that? Jack 61.
I remember it. I remember reading it. I think we actually read it.
Yeah.
It's not been too awfully long ago.
Yep, correct. So this is truly remarkable. You've got all these mistakes and insinuations going through the trial that the judge is hearing, that the jury is hearing, thinking, oh my God, she really was shot. And it was done by Stephen. So that, in effect, what hung him. No doubt about it. And now we have the situation where Ken Kratz and the state have now tried to diffuse item FL, despite the fact that it should never been submitted in the first place. They're now backpedaling, saying, oh, yeah. Item FL wasn't the bullet that killed Teresa Halbach, but it was effectively used during the trial. So, guys, I want to do at least one question. I'm getting tired myself and I'm just about to collapse. But we should do at least one question. Guys, do you agree on the panel?
Absolutely.
Let's do at least one question. Now, I quote, a straw man is a form of argument that attempts to give the impression of refuting an opponent's position while actually refuting an intentionally misrepresented version of that position, one that's easier to counter. In MAM 2, Kathleen Zellner sets up her very own straw man by falsely claiming that the state's theory, as presented to the jury, was that item FL, a bullet found under a compressor in the Avery garage, was the bullet that passed through Teresa Halbach's skull. MAM 2 then proceeds to knock down the straw man by proving the recovered bullet has no skull material attached to it. Notice what Kratz has done. It was him and the state that had the straw man argument with item FL, but he turned it around to say, no, it was Zellner that had the straw man argument. So here's the question. We've discussed it in a way. Question is this: where did Dr. Jensen get the notion that item FL had blood on it? And what was the source of DNA on the bullet? Guys, who would like to answer that one? So we have a bullet. Where did Dr. Jensen get the notion that there was blood on it? Jack 61.
You know, this is only really a guess. It's speculation. I want everybody to understand that. But to me, he would almost have to draw that conclusion from either Eisenberg or one of the other associated law enforcement, maybe even a prosecutor. I don't know where he would have gotten that. I can't think. If there's something out there that I'm not remembering, I apologize, but I don't know where else he would have gotten it. I really don't. And as far as for what's been reported as nucleated cells that Culhane found, it should have come from the undies that they take, the dirty underwear they collected. It could have come from any number of places as far as I'm concerned.
Oh, no, they never proved any nucleated cells, Jack 61. She was asked, where do you think the DNA came from? And she said it had to be from nucleated cells. They never proved the source of the DNA.
Gotcha.
Because Culhane simply stuck the bullet in a buffer and extracted all the DNA from that bullet, right? So she only guessed. So they did no testing what the cell types were.
Right.
Whether they were skin, saliva, who knows? They never tested it. She only just guessed where the DNA had come from, right? So you've got this remarkable situation whereby the medical examiner says that the bullet had blood on it. And he even said that must have meant that the bullet went through the brain when it had blood, right? So here we have Jensen talking about a bullet having gone through skull and having gone through brain that had blood in it. So in effect, he was making the claim that Ida Mafel was the bullet that caused Teresa Halbach's death, right? Bullet, got blood, goes through skull, hits the brain, full of blood. That's where it came from. So, and the state never, the important thing is this, guys, the state never linked Ida Mafel to the cranial bone fragments. They never did the testing. Unbelievable. All right, guys, do we have any other comments? All right. Okay. So, guys, we've covered a lot. I'm exhausted, I must admit. We covered a lot, but it was important, guys, that we covered Ida Mafel in the detail that we did, because it was devastatingly used against Stephen and obviously Brendan. It was a very, very clever trick. If you look at this from a scientific viewpoint, once you contaminate a negative control, all bets are off. You cannot draw any conclusions as to the test, a tube, the test result. You throw it out, you start again. Culhane had utilized all the DNA. She couldn't redo the test, so she desperately had to do something she has never, ever done before, and that's obtain a waiver form to try and get Ida Mafel submitted into a court of law, which she was successful in doing, despite the fact that her own supervisor, by law, had to sign the form. She never did. So that form was illegal and it was not fit for purpose, because you can only submit Ida Mafel for exclusionary purposes, not inclusionary purposes. So she made up her own rules. She was protected by Norm Garn, who made it a joke that the jury, the public, would understand that, you got to break a couple of rules every now and then. No worries, we can introduce Ida Mafel. Once Zellner's experts discovered that Ida Mafel never struck bone, never contained any bone shards, but contained wood, red paint, wax, it meant that Ida Mafel was not the cause of death. The way Kratz overcame this dilemma was he said, well, I never said it, and Neverly alluded to this before. Crest goes, I never said it, but I'll tell you right now, if you were sitting in the jury, if you were part of the jury, you would have logically made the connection that Teresa Halbach was shot in the head by Stephen Avery and Ida Mafel caused her death. No doubt about it. And then we have the state's response saying, oh, well, the whole point of Ida Mafel was it went through Teresa Halbach, and that's how we got her DNA. And the bizarre thing is, no one ever said, Kratz never said, Fallon, Gunn never said, well, we actually can't submit Ida Mafel because the negative PCR control was contaminated. All right, guys, I'd like to thank everyone in chat. Thank you so much for your great questions. I really do apologize if we've missed any of them. I'll go back and see if there are any questions there that I can answer later on. Thank you so much for joining us. Please, if you like what we do, subscribe. Leave your DNA on the thumbs up button. That really helps us. And I promise you, I'm not going to let Culhane anywhere near your DNA. I'd like to thank the panel for their great wisdom. But I want to leave with one question. I just want a yes or no. And the question is this: would it have made any difference to the outcome of the trial if Ida Mafel was never allowed to be submitted? Yes or no? Alice?
Yes.
You think it would have made a difference to the outcome if Ida Mafel wasn't submitted? Interesting.
Yes.
Interesting. I don't.
Because that's the whole case.
Yes.
So
yes. I don't recall. Do you think it would have made a difference? I don't recall. Are you there?
Sorry, I was muted. I said it should have, so I guess the answer is yes.
Okay, interesting. Jack 61, do you think it would have made a difference?
Yes, because the bullet's what connects Teresa to being inside the garage. Therefore,
100%.
Yeah, therefore a connection.
100% correct. Just Rhonda, do you think it would have made a difference?
No.
You don't think it would have made a difference?
No. They were going to convict Stephen no matter what they had to do.
Okay. But do you think it would have weakened their case without Ida Mafel?
Yes. But I still think they were going to make sure he was convicted.
Okay.
With
Good
or without
point.
it. That's just my opinion.
Okay. No. Excellent point. Neverly, what about yourself?
I'm with Rhonda. I don't think that it would have made a difference. It should, but I don't think it would have, because Wisconsin is not a land of logic. I'm being silly, of course. No, I think they were out to get Steve, and that all the other questionable evidence and misproven evidence and hidden evidence didn't make any sense either. I mean, didn't make a difference either. That's
correct.
Maybe I'm
correct.
pessimistic. Yeah. How about you?
You know, I'm sort of ambivalent on my answer. It should have made a difference. If Ida Mafel was not able to be submitted in court, it means that they didn't have a cause of death, which means that they couldn't link Stephen to the rifle firing Ida Mafel, causing the death of Teresa Halbach. Because the death of Teresa Halbach was by homicidal violence. The court, the state, desperately tried to connect Ida Mafel to the rifle to Stephen Avery shooting the rifle, shooting Ida Mafel, hitting Teresa Halbach in the skull, killing her in the garage, right? And hence tying the story of Brendan Dassey, right? Despite the fact that it was Wiegert who mentioned the shooting scenario. So you can imagine if Brendan Dassey had said, no, I don't know of any shooting scenario. No one had shot Teresa Halbach, right? The whole case would have been entirely weakened. But because of item FL, you literally put Teresa Halbach in that garage, which leads credence of the murder event. Without item FL, you still don't know where the murder took place. You got no idea. And that's why they were reliant. The state was reliant on Brendan Dassey to give him a scenario, right? Potentially, they could have set Stephen up at Cuss Road, right? But that wouldn't have worked. So in my opinion, they brought everything back to Stephen's property to tie the forensic evidence closer to him, right? So without item FL, you've taken away a very, very powerful element from the state's case. You're now very much trying to speculate what took place. With item FL, you close the loop. You say, yep, I told you she got killed in that garage. And then from the garage into the burn pit, right? So item FL was used very cleverly by the state during the trial, and then they abandoned it because Dr. Chris Palahniuk proved it never struck bone. It was not the bullet that killed her. And Neverly, do you have another comment?
Yes, and I totally agree with what you're saying. It's a hard question. It's a dilemma. Scientifically, yes, you're totally correct. However, practically, I believe, just like they needed Brandon's confession, we know that it was a coerced confession. You know what I mean? Look at the length that they went through to get him to say something, to confess, quote unquote. They would have found something. In that regard, I don't think that item FL, if it wasn't admitted, that it would have made a difference in that sense.
But put it this way, guys. The first court count, jury count, was 7 not guilty. 7. Imagine if there was no item FL. There would have been an element of doubt. An element of doubt. No matter what the states, you're correct, and I agree with Just Rhonda. The state, their intention was to find him guilty at all costs, at any cost. But the jury would have thought, we can't back up what Brendan said. We now don't trust Culhane. It puts an element of doubt, a stronger element of doubt. You could tell that I'm correct because the state is backpedaling. Ken Kratz is backpedaling. They don't want to touch item FL. So maybe if item FL couldn't have been introduced, it could have swayed the other jurors that said guilty. There would have been reasonable doubt, in my opinion. Neverly, do you have a final comment?
Yes, I think that we all feel the same way, actually. I'm just gonna say it again. Look what happened with Brandon. That they were gonna send him home Friday 8 o'clock. Everything was ready, and Schimmel came out and he trumped it. That in that regard, I think that even if there was no item FL, that they would have invented something else in order to keep him in. In that regard, yeah.
Correct, 100% correct. It's it is a travesty, and a tragedy. And I agree with what Jez Edwards says. He said the trouble is the judge allowed so many unlawful things to go on in that court. Beautifully summarized, correct. And by doing so, I believe it swayed the jury big time. Alice, do you have a comment?
Yeah, Jez Edwards, welcome to the chat. He also says it should have collapsed the case immediately, but based on everything else that happened in that courtroom, no, he doesn't think it would have changed anything.
Correct. But then you see, without Brendan Dassey, they had to speculate. They had to speculate how this all went down. Brendan Dassey gave them a narrative. So despite them not using Brendan during Stephen's trial, they used item FL in replace of Brendan, right? So it was very, very clever how they strategically used the bullet. And then after the trial, they abandoned it. because they knew it had no more power, but it did the damage. Jack 61.
And
Sorry,
sorry, Doc. Ronald D. Cass, welcome in the chat. Thanks for joining us. He says it's an absolute certainty Sherry Culhane had to pretend to swab the bullets and swap the swabs, then prevent the possibility of retesting by claiming she used all the sample.
That's correct. And think about it, guys. Two very powerful pieces of forensic evidence that nailed Stephen was the key. So you've got a personal object belonging to the victim inside Stephen Avery's bedroom. That's damning. And secondly, you've got a bullet that only has Teresa Horbach's genomic DNA on it in the garage. So in effect, Sheree Culhane was able to deliver what Tom Fassbender requested. Try to put her in the trailer and the garage. She did. Right? So, like I said, it's a travesty and a tragedy. And that's why years later, we're still debating the case, and we're still debating the validity of item FL. Truly remarkable. All right, guys. Well, look, I'd like to thank everyone for coming along. Thank you so much in chat. Please subscribe if you haven't subscribed. Give us a thumbs up if you enjoyed the podcast. And again, guys, thank you so much for your support. Like I said, all money that we raise, we reinvest back into the channel by buying documents and other items, placing them on our website for you guys to do your own research. And guys, take care, and we'll all catch up next week. Thank you so much.
This has been a Foul Play production.